Okay, just welcome to the webinar. My name is JJ, John Taukave. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Our title, our theme is the Net Zero Framework on Life Support and what are the options for the Pacific. So at the outset, and behalf of the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport and our team, I wish to convey our sincere appreciation and acknowledgement to each and every one of you who have made the time out of your busy schedules to be part of our first webinar for 2026. It's an exciting year for us. We have heaps of stuff coming out, and we really appreciate your time in joining us tonight. So in that regard, I also like to express our sincere gratitude to our panelists today, as well as our keynote speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Albert Nishoda, the Special Envoy for Maritime Decarbonization from the Marshall Islands. Welcome, Ambassador. Yakwe. As well as our advisor and legal researcher with MCST, Mr. John Fatui Moana Kautoke, who is also a panelist for us. And with that, in opening the session, I wanted to share a little piece to get us in the groove. I know we heard some intros, but I wanted to share a piece from the beautiful islands of the Marshalls, a piece of Thanksgiving. Again, thanking each and every one of you for joining us tonight, but also thanking you for your work. And we hope that the work that we continue at the IMO and in these discussions and the Talanoa will continue to be fruitful throughout the year. So this is a Marshallese song, and I hope you enjoy it. Eworta imeron ba imain eman la jenau meron impa kumbultata kumkanu jenmo kinchot kenami woden Jones was Jones. Eworta imeron ba emrabi meman la jenau meron impa kumbultata kumkanu jenmo kinchot kenami wonen Jones was Jones was Ienina du tabelina limoin kalimo koye kiwo mi woli tia kom kanu chenmo ta ienina du tabelina limoin kalimo koye kiwo mi woli tia kom kanu chenmo ta. Thank you. And with that vibe, I wish to kindly invite His Excellency Ambassador Albert Nishoda from the Marshall Islands, Special Envoy for Maritime Decarbonization, to deliver our keynote address. Kumul Tata, over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, JJ, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Just want to note that song that John just sang, it's a Marshallese song, and it means thank you very much from the bottom of our heart. So let me start off by saying Yahweh from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, from Oceania, and from a people whose future is inseparable from the ocean. Maritime decarbonization is a matter of survival, sovereignty, and intergenerational justice for our communities. Whilst political discourse have stalled progress towards adoption of the net zero framework, the climate crisis continues to intensify everywhere, but especially at home. Rising seas, intensifying storms, and coral bleaching are lived realities across our atoll nations. At the same time, global shipping, regulated by the International Maritime Organization, remains without a fully 1.5 aligned decarbonization pathway. The 2023 IMO GHG strategy's levels of ambition calls for the decarbonization efforts to be consistent with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. The ICJ advisory opinion makes clear that the primary temperature goal of the Paris Agreement is 1.5. Over the years, the six-pack plus countries have consistently called for a universal carbon levy for absolute emission reductions aligned with the data and science, and for a just and equitable transition that leaves no country behind. Despite falling short of 1.5 alignment, the net zero framework remains the only politically viable option which could support a timely decarbonization of the international shipping whilst delivering sufficient revenues to fund a just and equitable energy transition. So the question before us today or tonight is whether the net zero framework is on life support. And this is not a rhetorical question, but an urgent one. As we will see with the current trajectory in the status of the net zero framework, we are provided with scenarios on moving forward and what this would do for our region and other regions that have SIDS and LDCs. But commitments without enforcement, targets without timelines, and delayed ambition without equity will not deliver the transformation required. The shipping sector has the innovation, the capital, and the capacity to change course. And what is required now is for the IMO to give the private sector the confidence it needs to make the needed investments for the long-term transition. Such confidence can only be instilled by an unambiguous and ambitious framework that provides certainty across the board. Certainty for the investors, certainty for the energy transition, and certainty that countries will not be left behind. The Pacific has always navigated by stars and swells, currents and seabirds, and so today we navigate towards climate justice in the maritime decarbonization space. Let us ensure that the net zero framework will be a turning point without any further delays. Many thanks to all of you and Komol Dada for joining us this morning, this evening, this afternoon. Back to you, John.
Komor Tata, thank you very much, Ambassador Ishoda, for that. Thank you for delivering that keynote with some really powerful points for our webinar today. And now I hand it over to Miss Kiri Lalovaki to bring us into presentation with a few slides on the options that we have. Over to you, Kiri.
Bulvinaka to our guests. My name is Kiri Lalovaki, and I'm an intern researcher at the Micronesia Center for Sustainable Transport. My task this morning, this evening, this afternoon, is to set the scene for our Talanoa and provide the context for our panelists. It's a big topic. Where are we up to with delivering the measures to decarbonize world shipping? And it has a long history. I'm going to try and do it in 8 slides and 8 minutes, Let's start with the history. In 1997, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, specialist UN agency that we all rely on to regulate global shipping, first discussed shipping's emissions in the context of climate change. Basically, 3 points were agreed. Shipping needed to take decisive action. The IMO was the correct body to take that action, and a hard price on shipping's emissions was going to be essential. That was followed by a lot of meetings, reports, briefings, expert groups, and more meetings until in 2013, Saudi Arabia called for a vote on what to do with the revenues from an economic measure. They lost the vote, but the resulting political atmosphere was so toxic, everyone agreed the economics was just too hard and that MEPC would shelve more work on targets and pricing emissions, and we'd focus on shipping efficiency instead. In 2015, the Pacific, 6 high ambition states, led by Tony DeBrum, the six-pack, arrived at IMO calling for real targets commensurate with a 1.5-degree agenda. More meetings, reports, initial strategies, working groups later, and in 2020, the six-pack calls for a mandatory universal levy, the obvious measure and the one agreed by all experts, from the UN Secretary General down, as the next essential step. Finally, in 2023, we all agreed unanimously a strategy to decarbonize by 2050, complete with timelines and checkpoints. All that was left to do was to agree on the measures. More talking, working groups, expert groups, compromise on compromise. And in 2025, we walked into MEPC with a large majority of states and industry voting 63-16 to approve the draft amendments to MAPOL. It seemed the job was done. The net zero framework had arrived. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time ever, a major industrial sector was poised to deliver a real price on GHG emissions. But, and it is a huge but, at the last moment, the US arrived on a white charger. The Petros was suddenly empowered, and yes, you guessed it, the Saudis called for a vote. The whole process was put on pause for a year, possibly forever. In that afternoon, shipping went from being the front runner, the sector that was ready to take real action to keep 1.5 alive and on the table, to a chaotic rebel. So that's the history. What are options now on the table for the net zero framework? Our colleagues, Christian de Bucla from Melbourne University and Beatriz Romero from CLIMA, suggest there are 5 possible pathways, and I am going to run through them briefly. Survival is the best case scenario available. Here, the net zero framework is adopted by a majority and enters into force through the IMO's standard tacit acceptance process. This means that it becomes legally binding unless a large minority actively blocks it. In practical terms, this outcome delivers real emissions reductions, predictable rules for industry and climate finance. This is the only scenario that aligns with the IMO's climate commitments and gives us a possible pathway to meeting the 2030 and 2040 checkpoints. The NZF is not perfect, it's not really 1.5 aligned, and it's still a compromise from what is really needed, but it's the best alternative we have today. The second scenario is the coma scenario. This reflects continued delay. The framework is neither adopted nor rejected. It simply remains on hold. While this keeps the proposal technically alive, it does not deliver action. Each delay erodes political momentum, increases uncertainty, and allows fragmented regional measures to expand. Over time, the risk grows that the framework never recovers. This is the death scenario. The death scenario refers to the outright rejection of the framework through a majority vote. This would formally end the NZF as a policy option. While this outcome is damaging, it does at least provide clarity. The international community would then need to restart discussions on alternative measures, a process that would take a significant time and political effort. The next slide is the zombie scenario. This is a particularly risky scenario. Here, the framework is adopted using an explicit acceptance process. which requires a high number of countries and shipping tonnage to actively approve it. If those thresholds are not met, the framework never enters into force. The result is a policy on paper, but delivers nothing in practice, creating the illusion of progress while avoiding responsibility for failure. This is the mutant scenario, where political negotiations are reopened, leading to further compromises and changes in the framework. This risks weakening climate ambition, undermining equity provisions, and prolonging uncertainty. Any substantial changes would also reset the procedural timeline, pushing implementation further into the future. For many vulnerable countries, this outcome crosses a red line. There is another option. I know it's probably just a fantasy, a myth. It would take a miracle. But just imagine for a moment that we could cut through all the mindless politics, the denialism, and just for a moment act like real human beings, like adults, informed by science, driven by responsibility, and scared to death about the state of the world we are leaving our children. In 1997, we all knew we needed to take decisive action, that the IMO was the only body that can take real action, and that a real and hard price on emissions is the next essential step. Deep down, any thinking person knows that is doubly true today. Panelists, I have only one question. Is it wrong to hope for miracles? It seems to me that for our Pacific communities, nothing short of a miracle is what we need today. Komal Tata, Vinaka Vakalevu, and John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kiri, for the presentation, for the slides. Well articulated, much appreciated. And now I'll hand it over to our esteemed panelist, Ambassador Albany Shoda, and the Toko, John Fatui Moana Kautoke. Before I go to Kiri's question, I wanted to go back to a little bit of a history lesson on how we got to where we are right now. And I know, Ambassador, you were with Tony DeBroom, from that turning point when we started to really engage at the IMO. And I wanted to ask on your experiences and your feedback or your reflections on those moments leading up to now.
Well, thank you, John. I think that if I go through the history of how we got there, it's gonna take the whole space, including more. But I'd like to just acknowledge that in 2015, when the Marshall Islands and a few Pacific islands, including Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and others, came to the MEPC that year, we knew that the issue of decarbonizing shipping had already been discussed and had been a very toxic one from 2 years prior. However, because we were able to muster up the political will to take the conversation forward, and it was a difficult conversation, we were able to get IMO to at least consider setting targets for the sector. When that happened, the IMO itself, the MEPC, told us to wait for the outcome of the Paris Agreement, in a way that IMO does, letting us know that, yep, we hear you, but we cannot do anything until we have something. So at the Paris Agreement, Minister de Broom, and I might add other Pacific Island countries, really fought hard for a 1.5 target to underpin the global decarbonization efforts. When that happened, we came back to IMO the next year, and the IMO had no choice. However, knowing how these things work, it took us another 10 years to get to where we are. But it goes without saying that it has been a tremendous effort by the Pacific Island countries, and in the last year, including other partners from the Caribbeans and the African countries, that recognize the need for a decarbonized sector that addresses and considers the needs of SIDS and LDCs, those most vulnerable that are both affected by climate change and affected by shipping in general. And from there on, it's unfortunate what happened last year. But here we are. I don't want to take too much time, but here we are back on the table. I think I should say that the Pacific is not giving up, and the Pacific is not known to give up on these global challenges. We always say in the Marshall Islands, and I believe across the Pacific, that our solutions sometimes may be local, but they really make an impact globally. And that's the other part of the conversation we're having with partners, along with our other Pacific Island countries, six-pack plus. But I think, and thank you, Kyrie, for that very, very good presentation. I think you really give us an idea of what's ahead. And for me, I think, I believe in miracles, Kyrie. And I hope that many of us in this room and others across our global community will also believe that, it is possible. And the fact of the matter is, we have seen commitments. So it is possible to do what we need to do. So we just need the political will to carry it, and the Pacific will continue to push for that. Sorry for those winded statement, John, but I'll hand it back to you and JK.
Come on, Ambassador, and please don't apologize. It's always good to get a little bit of a history lesson to remind us where we came from and where we started from. And I mean, building on what you had shared, Ambassador, please, audience, feel free to check out. We have a Just and Equitable Transition podcast with an episode that we released in December on the whole timeline, on that whole history of where we started with the late Tony DeBrum and Ambassador sharing in that episode. So please join in on that one. Brother, John Kautoke, I'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, just thinking on that question and also on the reflections by Ambassador, I think I'm a relatively newcomer to this whole conversation. I mean, relative to people who have been following it for a long time, like Ambassador himself. I think we were really, really hoping that something might come out in October, and that was, it seemed like there was something in reach. And of course, there was always a possibility that we might not get something with all the pressure from various geopolitical issues. But I think for the Pacific, we've always been guided by that science-driven approach. That's something that's guided us all along the way, and the data. And that's also something that we try to follow in other forums, keeping to the science and the data about what we can do to make sure that the solutions we are forming are aligned to a reality where everyone can survive, and our islands can survive. So that's the 1.5 alignment. And as Ambassador said in his opening statement, this was a big compromise for the six-pack to shift to this new net zero framework, which is not 1.5 aligned. And it's probably not going to deliver a transition which is 1.5 aligned, but we see the value in it, ensuring that there's a energy transition in shipping, and also having revenues to spend on this just and equitable element of the transition, which is really important for developing countries, SIDS and LDCs. I think about whether it's on ice, it really depends on the politics and the way it sways. There's a lot of pathways. Right now, there's no right or wrong answer of what's going to happen, because there's so much happening right now all around us, politics in the US, economic issues around the world, and there's so many things happening. And right now, what we can't see is whether we're going to have one or the other. There's several pathways that we can try to figure out where things are going to end up. And it's a shame that we have to come down this path where we have to be looking at various specific strategies. But I think for the Pacific, we've always been guided by the science. We've always been driven by the data. And that's something that we will continue to look at when we go forward. It's something that we've always said from the beginning, this have to be a science-based approach to the way that we do things at the IMO. And indeed, the IMO takes that approach in all of its other work. So why is it different when we come to this area of work where the climate science and the economics is what meant to be driving a very ambitious transition? And so for us, it's very difficult to see what are the options, because the net zero framework as a compromise, and it should be adopted as it is right now. This year, we called for urgency last year. As you recall, Ambassador, urgency was one of our main messages we're putting out, because we need to adopt measures with urgency to address the climate crisis, and also to have something extremely ambitious and a transition which actually is just and equitable for SIDS like us, because we don't have the same opportunities and challenges in terms of shipping that other regions face. But yeah, I think, John, it really depends on the politics, on the amount of outreach that supporters of the net zero framework do, and also just on countries being able to see the opportunities that we can achieve with the net zero framework. I think it's really important that an ambassador talked about certainty. I think certainty is something that everyone is looking for, not just the private sector, but also member states. As Ambassador said, we need to ensure certainty that no country will be left behind. And I think that there are countries who don't see that certainty right now in the framework, because there's a lot of gaps, there's a lot of guidelines we have to develop. And so that's work that we can do right now, but we really need to adopt something as soon as possible and get working on those guidelines to bring people on. But yeah, I think that's my response for now, and we can continue the Talanoa, and obviously from people who are also part of the conversation who are attending the call. I mean, I've seen a lot of colleagues attending these calls, and yeah, good to get their perspective too. Thanks, John.
Awesome. Malo toko. It's great that you've shared those opinions, which is building to the next question. And again, thanks to Kiri, and thanks also to Dr. Christian de Bukelai for the article and sharing these scenarios. Now, moving on to Kiri's question was, do we believe in miracles? We're presented with 5 scenarios: the survival, the coma, the death, the zombie, and the mutant scenarios for the net zero framework. And so building up towards the upcoming meetings in MEPC, I think MEPC 84 in April, how likely are these scenarios to come? And in your opinions, what are your views for these scenarios and for the Pacific? I'll hand it over to you, Ambassador, first to share a little bit before.
Thank you, John. I think it's no secret that the road ahead is not going to be an easy one.
Yeah.
It's going to be it's going to require a lot of us, especially member countries, to recognize the benefit of what's on the table versus what's not on the table. And I think we will dig ourselves our graves if we I'll say this personally, for the islands, it will be a very, very bad outcome if nothing, if we don't adopt anything in the next extraordinary session, simply because we don't have the time. Urgency, as stated, has always been one of the key issues that pushes our global work with our international partners forward. We see intensifying storms across the Pacific, multiple hurricanes, and people are just getting affected left, right, and center by the impacts of climate change, whether that be sea level rise, increased in frequency and intensity of storms, coral bleaching that affects their food pantries or their livelihoods. And I say this because many times when we're talking about shipping, we're talking about the long road ahead. It has taken us over a decade now to put this debate together and to advance this discussion in IMO. And I think whether the Pacific is the region that has been leading this, the effects of climate change does not stop with us. It goes across to other parts of the world. And as John said, the most vulnerable and those most impacted need the assurance and the certainty that in this transition, they are uh, being considered, they are part of the transition. And like I said before, John, I believe in miracles, but it will take a lot of work, especially a lot of dialogue with partners to move us forward. This cannot be done alone by the Pacific Island countries and plus Seychelles, um, but it requires multiple countries to come on board. And I believe that, yes, there is changes in the geopolitics and how the global world order operates. Uh, but I think 99% of us believe that in multilateralism, we still believe that we, as a whole, as a global community, need to work together to ensure the safety of our planet. We've always said that the Pacific, especially countries like the Marshall Islands that are low-lying atolls, sort of the front lines of the front lines, we've always known that we are somewhat the canaries in the mine. What happens to us will affect others. Maybe not tomorrow, but eventually it will affect others. So, there is a hard road ahead, and we need to navigate our way around the politics. And I think there will always be strength in numbers. And if we all come together united, backed by the science, and this is the thing, backed by the science, then I think we could overcome political disturbance elsewhere. And there is a role for everyone, not just member states, but our non-government partners, including media, to help frame these discussions. Many times they are framed around industry's narratives and not from people-centric narratives. And I think we need to start as a whole working together to advance and push forward our agenda to decarbonize shipping.
Thank you, Ambassador. Much appreciated with your inputs there. I'll head it over to JK in terms of outreach and what we've been doing, the Pacific has been doing in the build up towards these meetings. How has that been going especially towards April, Toko?
I think JJ, just before I come to answer the question, I think outreach for during these GSG negotiations, ever since the 2023 strategy has been it's a tough and long task. You have to organize meetings and try to get common positions, but it's something where we could see in the past two outcome negotiations, first for the net zero framework and then for the strategy, that there was something coming out of those outreaches. I think the outreach this time has been quite difficult because, and this is a rhetorical question, how do you convince a country, to come onto your side who's not certain that anything we can give them would outweigh the cost of going against the United States, for example? And how do you convince a country who's completely reliant or is in the sphere of influence of the US to support the net zero framework now. It's a difficult landscape for outreach, I think, at the moment. And we have been seeing that across the board. I think there are a couple ways you can go about it. You can probably focus on strengthening the support for the net zero framework, trying to maintain the group of countries who voted against delaying adoption, and that core group of countries, trying to do outreach there. Or you can try to build bridges with the other side, as we've done in the past, trying to reach compromise and trying to get something that we can agree to by consensus as the adoption question comes around again. And I think doing it in that latter way, trying to build bridges, has become extremely difficult because we know that there are countries who don't want the framework at all. And that's become very clear since the last session. There are just countries who do not want the framework as it is, which again was an extremely major compromise for the Pacific. And I think to compromise further on the net zero framework would be to decrease the ambition, which for us, there's already a lack of ambition, which is the net zero framework. And so compromise on the package as it is right now, in the text as it is, and the regulations that are written right now, it's just not possible from the Pacific perspective. It's going to transgress our regional positions. And the 1.5 is something that we're very strong on. And we see that there's potential to increase the ambition of the current package as it is. But if there's any further work towards compromise, we feel that that'll be extremely dangerous to the whole net zero framework and the ability to increase that ambition later on. We've already been hearing quite worrying things about the compromises that are on the table. And this is also apparent in the scenarios which were presented by Kiri. I think looking at, removing the economic element altogether, that's a big thing that we've been hearing right now. And it seems like it's probably going to be a proposal to remove the economic element, which is also really extremely dangerous for the net zero framework from a climate ambition perspective. It's just completely unacceptable to have the removal of the fund element because it's so central to the mechanism. I think there's other compromises that have been proposed. For example, delaying, leaving it as a zombie. That's a big that's something that countries might be considering because they want a more favorable political landscape. And that's understandable because the political landscape right now, it's quite a challenging landscape to get any kind of climate or environmental agreement, actually adopted. And so it's understandable to go for that delay and to try to push for a time when we have a landscape which is a bit more similar to 2024 or like early last year, we were able to get the net zero framework approved for circulation in April. And that's something that from right now, from the conversations we've been having, we feel that some of the countries we work with are probably considering that if we have a situation where the adoption is unlikely or is likely to fail, then they will try to push for that further delaying of adoption. But I think for us, as Ambassador said, it's about urgency at this point. I mean, we've already delayed again a whole year. And as Ambassador said, the politics can delay, but the climate crisis continues. It continues unabated. And the more we move down that path, the more likely it is that shipping won't contribute its fair share to the climate crisis, to solving the climate crisis, which it has contributed to, not just in terms of its own emissions, but in terms of moving, carbon-based energy sources around the world is moved by shipping. And it's something that, it's very important for us that we're able to see the adoption of that package this year and then adopting it as it is right now. And saying that any additional concerns countries have, countries who don't see the net zero framework as something they could go ahead with, those concerns can be addressed in the guidelines. If we remember, JJ, there are guidelines that need to be developed.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of detail that has to go into those guidelines. And a lot of concerns, which we've been hearing, can be addressed through those guidelines. And I know there are some people attending this call who have been part of that work to develop the guidelines for Z and Z, GFI, for example. We've seen some positive movement in that front, and like there's some work being carried out there and some guidelines which would be coming out. I haven't been personally following that too closely, but I am part of the email chains. But there has been some movement on that front. But if we look at countries from Africa, for example, who need to see certainty, for example, in the fund, the work has not been really done on that side. And if you recall at the last ISWG, we did ask for a seminar or a webinar to be run on the fund, but that wasn't possible. But you know, there's still a lot of detail in that regard that we have been working with at the technical level, with some African technical experts to try to look at those details and try to see what is the detail that they need to see certainty that they wouldn't be left behind and that the funds would actually be able to reach them for their needs. But yeah, just to recap, I think the outreach has been quite challenging. I have personally been following the Net Zero Friends, as have others in this call, following the Net Zero Friends group, which has been going along quite well. I think that group is quite strong. But I think there has been quite a lack of developing countries that have been part of that call consistently. But there are members of the developing countries in that group. And so, I mean, my hope is that we would see that group maintain its cohesion as we move closer to MEPC 84 and at MEPC 84, since it's quite a good group to increase our outreach potential to countries that we can still bring on board for the net zero framework.
Yo, malo, bro. Thank you for sharing, the updates on the outreach. And thank you to Ambassador. Now I'm gonna opening it up to our audience. We have a question from Lyndall Rowlands. I hope I got your name correct. My apologies if I haven't. A journalist with Al Jazeera, who had mentioned, on U.S. influence, is there much awareness or engagement in the U.S., for example, among Congress members? And I'll give it to the panelists and to our esteemed audience. Feel free to raise your hand or post your comments or your questions in the chat. But first, I'll give it to our panelists.
Thank you for that important question. For us, we will always continue to try and reach out to our partners in the U.S., including the U.S. government itself. I think our approach has never been to shy away or to just shut out whoever opposes it. I think it's important to have dialogue so that people understand, member countries understand each other. Has it been easy? Not really, but it won't stop us from continuing to reach out to the U.S. Through the different branches, through those that understand it, understand the debate a bit more with the context of human-centric. I think it's also important to note that we see the U.S. state, the administration's hard line on any climate related issues, but at the same time we see states picking up where where the ball is dropped, and I think it's worth. I mean, unfortunately, there's only a few of us that can do this. I mean, if you look in the room and you could easily pick out a handful of the people that have been part of this debate, especially those from the Pacific, from the very beginning. And we are always, I'm always aware that, we don't have the bandwidth nor the resourcing to go out into Congress every now and then to lobby hard. But we do have friends in places that we continue to speak with, continue to talk with, and raise these issues. And I think that has always been the challenge for the Pacific and particularly small island developing states is, one of our, for example, one of our senior official is he runs a whole maritime safety program here. So, he doesn't, I mean, he only has another staff. We don't have a full army of experts around him that can do many of these work. So we have to rely on each other and our research center to provide scientific and analysis of these work. But again, in short, we will continue to reach out to not just the US, but others. I think many of the Pacific countries have cordial relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'm sure conversations are happening around those areas as well. But yeah, I mean, I wish we could have done more, and I wish we could do more. But given our limited bandwidth, we have to focus on how to resuscitate or how to ensure that the net zero framework moves forward. And on a final note, John, because I forgot to mention, I think it's important to understand that 1.5 was a compromise for the Pacific. We were not happy with 1.5, but we had to compromise on it. The net zero framework, if you go back to the history of the voting, 63 countries voted for it. The six pack plus didn't. Six pack plus Seychelles didn't vote for it because we felt that it fell short of delivering on a 1.5 alignment. And then now we are. It's a bit unfortunate that it's always the small islands that are being asked to compromise. And this time around, I think we have, and we need to, for the sake of this argument, for the sake of the decarbonization agenda, we need to continue to open ourselves for dialogues, and we will continue to do that, including with the US.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I think also, yeah, it's pretty important to maintain conversations with the US. I think we've been relying a bit on on countries who clearly support the net zero framework to do some outreach to the US, and what we've heard is that the positions have become entrenched since the last negotiation. But I think there's some positives coming out with the recent Supreme Court decision. So we're waiting to see how that would change the landscape a little bit in terms of tariffs, because those are the main threats that Trump has been using right now, is tariffs, and seeing what the landscape change would be because of the Supreme Court decision would be very interesting as the week go ahead.
Thank you, Toko. I think Peter put a message up, and I think I'll give it to you, Toko, to look at it. This is up on IMO docs at the moment, right now. Panama, Liberia, and Argentina have co-sponsored a submission calling for stripping out the economic element, which means no establishment of an IMO fund or any other mechanism involving direct revenue collection and disbursement. Toko, do you have a comment on this to share on this?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've been anticipating. We just didn't know which side it would come from, and now we see where it's coming from. I think the document has been submitted, but we don't know in what format, because the format will dictate whether we can discuss it in plenary or not. Because if it's an INF paper, it can't be presented and discussed too much, I think, but it can be made reference to. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, we have been foreseeing that this would come. I mean, it's unfortunate that it's coming from the large registries. It's a really bad signal of where things are going. But yeah, it's something that it is unacceptable. But I think it should push countries to try to consider what, if we don't get the net zero framework as it is, what is the alternative to that? And from our side, we've been trying to look at the alternative, and for the Pacific, it's really the levy. Because if we try to reopen a net zero framework for further consideration and edit and substantial amendments and this type of proposals to remove the fund, the economic element, it's going to revert the discussions to, what we had last year, the years before, very polarized discussions and, one versus another. And it's just we thought that we passed all of that when we were coming towards a net zero framework, but it's clear it's going to revert to those times. And for us, the levy remains the most ambitious mechanism that there is to deliver a just and equitable transition. That's what the data says. That's what the science says. If comprehensive impact assessment says that as well in the long term. But yeah, I think that it's just going to get to that point. And so countries really have to consider now what is their alternative to the net zero framework when it comes to a situation like that. And just to be transparent, there is a submission going in with some amendments, which has been put in by the Marshall Islands, I think, and that has some amendments in the situation where we have to reopen and discuss. We anticipated that would revert to that earlier polarized negotiation landscape, and others can disagree with that, but I think that is where we're heading right now. But yeah, it's very we anticipated it, and now we need to do work towards trying to maintain support to the net zero framework.
Yeah.
As it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think it's very unfortunate that we have 3 developing countries putting that forward. I would have expected that from at least the United States, but 3 developing countries that are themselves facing climate crises across, whether you talk about the diminishing water level at the Panama Canal or droughts across the African continent. I mean, this is something that the Marshall Islands really, really looks at very closely because, those 3 countries, 2 of them are the largest shipping registries.
Yeah.
And this is a moral commitment on part of the Marshall Islands. Yes, the registry is an important revenue source for our country, but what does that mean for our future generation if we don't fight hard for our existence? So, as John said, we will continue to reach out and try and bridge the gap. I believe we know, we understand what our red lines are. And, the more countries that come on board and recognize that the Pacific is fighting for not just climate justice, but a just and equitable transition, I think that is also an important point to note. Just an equitable transition does not mean, the Pacific will not benefit as much from it as other parts of the world, including Africa, or Latin America, and others. Yet, at the last session, the Pacific was the only one, amongst the others, including our committed partners from Seychelles, were the only ones fighting for a just and equitable transition. And it's not surprising anymore, but it just requires that again we get the framing of the narrative right by our non-government partners, by the media in general, so that the conversation becomes not about this is the carbon tax on goods or on trade, but it becomes how do we ensure that shipping remains relevant in an ever-changing space. And we kid ourselves when we do not recognize that other major emerging economies have already invested in their transition away from fossil fuel in the shipping sector. The last thing I think that will hurt the Pacific community and others across is when we have patchwork of regional initiatives or regional regime, such as the ETS, that ends up costing more. And those that will be affected the most, including the countries of Africa that try to trade within the EU zone, And of course, the Pacific Island countries that are the most remotest from the market. So, there's so much layer to this, and I think it's important that the framing of this discussion is done right.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll have a final question from Caro de Wolf. Again, we've reached the top of the hour, and we also have a question. So, Caro de Wolf, please, if I apologize for if I pronounce it wrong. Are we considering bridging the unicorn scenario to the table to counterbalance for other proposals lowering the net zero framework ambition? Toko, I'll hand it over to you. And please, anyone else in the chat, please raise your hand if you have any comments or questions. Thank you.
I think it was, I think it's more based on what would happen, answering the question of what would happen for us if the net zero framework is opened up and we start cutting the net zero framework. And that's something that I think strategically countries and regions need to think about, because we're going to be standing only on the net zero framework and pushing for adoption as it is all the way until we get to a stage where we see that actually this thing is going to be opened up for cutting. As I said, I think we need to have something on the table for that to, our position on what happens at that point. And also it's the science-based thing, right? We have to go back to the science-based solutions that we need, something that's aligned to 1.5 and ambitious. And when we talk about miracles, whether it's likely to happen, I mean, that remains to be seen if we reopen it and try to push for the levy again. But, we need to be in a position where we're advocating for something that is 1.5 aligned, because that's the position of the Pacific Islands as a region in the Pacific Island Forum. Like, that's our position. We need 1.5 alignment across the board. And so that's why we're putting that forward. That's the primary reason for it. And if there is a strategic advantage to putting something out there to counterbalance the negative, this push particularly to remove the fund, that's something on the side, but that's not the primary reason. The primary reason is that we have to be in a position where we're aligned with our region all the way if we can't get the net zero framework as it is. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll hand it over to Captain Adams. You had your hand raised. And then I'll give it to Michael Pren.
Thanks very much. Just wanted to, one of the things about Seychelles, I don't know how many other countries are like this, but within our constitution itself, Article 38 is the right to a right to safe environment. Part A of that is to take measures to promote the protection, preservation, and improvement of the environment. So it is our constitutional responsibility within Seychelles to actively participate in ensuring environmental protection for future generations. That is our obligation. So we have a constitutional responsibility to do that at international forums and locally. We don't really have we have a moral obligation, we have a constitutional obligation, and we have a legal obligation. And foreign states cannot tell us to go against the Constitution. So we have to be careful about how we vote in forums and how we act, because if we do things against our Constitution, it counterbalances what we are trying to do as a state, even as a small island state. Well, actually, we're more for a large ocean state, but anyway.
Thank you. Michael Pren.
Right. I just wanted to say, all these scenarios we're looking at, they would all also have to be adopted. Like the mutant scenario would have to be adopted. This proposal from Panama and Liberia would have to be adopted. And there's not going to be a majority for those. They would also need the 2/3 majority. And since we actually have a very large majority that are not in favor of them, then these are not going to be adopted. They're going to be pressures in order to get us to change our mind or whatever it is. And they're distractions. The bottom line is that the the really stringent opposition from the US is going to be to any measure whatsoever. So it makes no sense to consider compromises, because getting the levy is going to be just as easy as getting the net zero framework. And what we need is to have a process which is more resilient to US pressure. We don't have to adjust anything. I think it will have to be the net zero framework because we have broad support for that. But there's no advantage to diluting it in any way. That was my point.
Many thanks, Michael, and thank you to the panelists again. We have gone a little bit over time, but again, we all anticipated this. I really must thank the audience, and also thanks to our panelists. Final one is: do any of our panelists have any final words or final reflections before we end?
Thank you, John. I agree with Michael Pren on the other proposals being put forward and being distracting or becoming distractions. I think it's important to understand the process within IMO is we have certain amount of days that we have to agree on something. And the more proposals that are thrown into that mix, the longer our debate becomes. And we have to be very focused on what we want. Ultimately, we want something that can assist in the transition of SIDS and LDCs, amongst others. And that the least among those is the net zero framework. But the best amongst those is the reintroduction of the carbon levy. And it's a conversation that needs again to form along the way. But it is one that I think we shouldn't leave behind, especially our option on reintroducing the carbon levy, because I believe that is the only mechanism that can deliver both on a 1.5 alignment, the energy transition required, and ensuring that no country is left behind in this transition. Thank you, John.
Komol, Ambassador. Toko, any final?
I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of outreach and, especially outreach. But yeah, I think I do agree with what Michael Pren was saying about, we have to look at what we can do now to make sure that net zero framework gets adopted as it is. And that's something that we'll continue to look at and assist with and support going forward, and work together with all our partners as well, who are also doing their best to make sure that we get the net zero framework across the line.
There you have it. Thank you so much to our panelists, Ambassador Albany Shoda. Thank you very much, John Kautoke Toko. Thank you so much to our panelists. And also thank you to our audience for your questions. Really, really good questions. Thank you for the sharing as well from Michael and Captain Adams. Also, thank you to our presenter, Kiri, and the support team at MCST for making those presentation slides. And also thank you to our media and communications team at MCST as well for bringing all of this together. We really appreciate all of the work. Guys, stay tuned. We will be having more webinars coming up in the future. Stay tuned on our LinkedIn page. Stay connected on our YouTube channel page for recording for this webinar session. Also, as well, guys, stay tuned. Just an Equitable podcast will be releasing more content and information about upcoming meetings, but also about the people at the IMO, the climate and the shipping space. We really thank you guys. Stay tuned, more coming up. And with that, I hope you all have a blessed rest of your day, rest of your evening, rest of your afternoon, rest of your early morning, in whichever time zone you are. Komol Tata, thank you very much. Chee-hoo!
Good night.